There are moments in history when the world looks into the face of evil and sees not a monster, but a mirror. When the killer who stalks our nightmares wears the same smile we trust in daylight. When the predator is not lurking in shadows, but standing in plain sight with charm and confidence and a law degree. And it is precisely this contradiction, this fracture between appearance and reality, that forces us to confront an unbearable truth about human nature itself. That the capacity for unspeakable darkness can exist within someone who looks exactly like the person we would ask for directions or accept a ride from or sit beside in a lecture hall. And this is the story of how one man exploited that very trust, how he weaponized normalcy, how he turned the assumptions we make about safety and decency into instruments of death. And before we begin this journey into one of the darkest chapters of American criminal history, I want to welcome you to Crime and Prejudice, a channel dedicated to exploring true crime not through sensationalism, but through empathy, psychology, and a deep commitment to understanding the human stories behind the headlines. So if you're looking for content that treats these tragedies with the seriousness and respect they deserve while examining the psychological underpinnings of criminal behavior, please consider subscribing because we're building a community of thoughtful viewers who believe that true crime can be both compelling and conscientious. And now let's turn to a case that changed everything about how we think about serial killers. A case that began not with obvious warning signs, but with a young man who seemed destined for success, Theodore Robert Bundy. Born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, raised in a working-class family in Tacoma, Washington, a boy who by all accounts was intelligent, articulate, ambitious, the kind of student who volunteered at a crisis hotline, who worked on political campaigns, who got accepted to law school, who could have been anything. And perhaps that's what makes this story so profoundly disturbing. Not that evil exists, we've always known that, but that it can exist within someone who functions so seamlessly within society. Someone who understands exactly how to mimic the behaviors we associate with goodness. And throughout the 1970s, while America was healing from Vietnam and Watergate, while families were gathering around television sets and students were filling university campuses across the country, young women began disappearing, vanishing from parks and college towns and city streets. And at first, these disappearances seemed random, disconnected, the kind of tragedies that happen in a nation of millions. But slowly, methodically, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that would eventually reveal itself as the work of one man. A man who had learned to use his appearance, his education, his understanding of human psychology as weapons. And the hunting ground he chose was vast, stretching across Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and eventually Florida. A geography of terror that would claim at least 30 confirmed victims, though investigators believe the true number may be much higher, may include victims whose names we will never know, whose families still wait for answers that will never come. And this is where the story becomes not just about one killer, but about the vulnerabilities inherent in how we organize society, how we trust, how we assume that someone who looks a certain way, who speaks a certain way, who carries himself with confidence and charm, must be safe. And Bundy understood this. He understood it deeply. He understood that if he approached women in public places during daylight hours, if he wore a cast on his arm and asked for help carrying books to his Volkswagen Beetle, if he impersonated a police officer or a fire department official, if he simply looked like someone who belonged, then his targets would override their instincts, would suppress that small voice of caution that evolution had given them for exactly this purpose. And one by one they trusted him. One by one they walked toward the moment of their own destruction, believing they were simply helping a fellow human being in need or following the instructions of someone in authority. And this exploitation of trust, this perversion of the social contract, is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Bundy's methodology because it reveals how our greatest strength as a species, our capacity for cooperation and empathy, can become our greatest vulnerability when someone chooses to weaponize it. And as the bodies began to be discovered, as investigators started connecting disappearances across state lines, as witness descriptions started to align around a man with dark hair, good looks, and a tan Volkswagen, the hunt intensified. But Bundy was always one step ahead, always adapting, always moving. And there's something particularly haunting about the timeline of his crimes. The way they escalated, the way the intervals between murders shortened, suggesting not satisfaction, but an insatiable hunger, an obsession that consumed him more completely with each victim. And psychologists who have studied the case extensively point to this escalation as evidence of a profound psychological deterioration. A man who had perhaps once believed he could control his impulses gradually losing that battle, gradually becoming enslaved to the very darkness he thought he commanded. And during this period, Bundy was living what appeared to be a normal life, attending law school at the University of Utah, maintaining relationships, presenting to the world the image of an ambitious young man building a future. And this duality, this ability to compartmentalize, to murder and then return to mundane routines, to exist simultaneously in worlds of unspeakable violence and banal normalcy, speaks to a form of psychological fragmentation that challenges our understanding of human consciousness itself. And in 1975, the first crack appeared in his carefully constructed facade when he was arrested in Utah for failing to stop for a police officer. And what began as a routine traffic stop transformed into something far more sinister when officers discovered handcuffs, an ice pick, a crowbar, and other items in his vehicle. Items that had no innocent explanation, items that suggested preparation for abduction. And this arrest led to his identification in a police lineup by Carol Duranch, a young woman who had miraculously escaped an attempted kidnapping, a woman who had survived an encounter with Bundy and lived to identify him. And for the first time, the mask began to slip. The carefully maintained image of the charming law student began to reveal the predator beneath. And Bundy was convicted of kidnapping in 1976 and sentenced to prison. But this was far from the end of the story, because investigators from other states were now looking at him with renewed interest, connecting him to disappearances in Colorado. And he was extradited to Aspen to face murder charges. And it was during this period that Bundy did something that shocked everyone, something that demonstrated both his arrogance and his intelligence. He escaped, not once but twice. The first time by jumping from a courthouse window during a hearing, taking advantage of a moment when guards were less vigilant because they had bought into the image he projected, the image of a law student representing himself, someone too educated, too civilized to be a real threat. And he was recaptured after 6 days. But the second escape was more elaborate, more calculated. He lost weight. He crawled through a hole he had painstakingly created in the ceiling of his cell. He made his way through the building's crawl space and out into the night. And this time he stayed free for weeks. And during those weeks, he made his way to Florida. And it was in Florida, in January 1978, that Bundy committed perhaps his most horrific crimes, breaking into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in the early morning hours, attacking 4 women while they slept, killing 2 of them, and then just hours later attacking another young woman in a different location. And the violence of these attacks, the frenzy, the lack of control, suggested a man who had completely abandoned any pretense of restraint, a man who was now fully consumed by his obsessions. And this escalation from careful, calculated abductions to frenzied attacks in locations where capture was likely reveals the trajectory of his psychological collapse, the way his need had overtaken his caution, the way the predator had finally devoured the man. And his final known victim was 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, taken from her school in February 1978, murdered and discarded. And this crime, the murder of a child, seemed to cross even the loose boundaries that Bundy had maintained before, seemed to represent the complete dissolution of whatever psychological framework had once constrained him. And he was finally captured on February 15, 1978, pulled over for driving a stolen vehicle. And this time there would be no escape, no courtroom dramatics that would set him free. The evidence was overwhelming, the witness testimony was damning, and Florida had the death penalty, and Bundy's trials became media spectacles, some of the first to be televised nationally. And the public watched transfixed as this articulate, composed young man defended himself in court, cross-examining witnesses, making legal arguments, presenting himself as a victim of circumstantial evidence and overzealous prosecution. And even in the face of overwhelming evidence, he maintained his innocence for years. He played games with investigators. He offered to help solve other murder cases. He used information about his victims as bargaining chips in failed attempts to avoid execution. And this behavior reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Bundy's psychology. Not just that he killed, but that he continued to victimize, continued to manipulate, continued to treat human lives as currency in his ongoing performance, and psychologists who interviewed him, including FBI profilers who were pioneering the field of criminal psychology, found a man who was intelligent enough to understand the questions they were asking, sophisticated enough to recognize what they were looking for, but ultimately too narcissistic, too committed to his own mythology to provide fully honest answers. And there has been extensive debate about whether Bundy was a psychopath, a sociopath, whether he had antisocial personality disorder, or was simply evil in some indefinable way. But what seems clear from the record is that he possessed a profound inability to experience empathy, that he viewed other people not as conscious beings with their own interior lives, but as objects to be used, manipulated, and discarded. And yet, even this clinical description fails to capture the full horror of what he did, because his victims were not objects. They were daughters and sisters and friends. They were people with dreams and fears and plans for the future. They were individuals who died terrified and alone at the hands of someone who had chosen to see them as less than human. And in the end, after years of appeals and legal maneuvering, after countless interviews and psychological evaluations, after becoming perhaps the most studied serial killer in American history, Theodore Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair on January 24, 1989. And outside the prison crowds gathered, some to protest the death penalty, others to celebrate. And this spectacle, this carnival atmosphere around an execution, revealed something troubling about how society processes these crimes, how we oscillate between fear and fascination, between horror and entertainment. And in his final interviews, Bundy attempted to blame pornography for his crimes, to present himself as a victim of media corruption. And most experts view this as a final manipulation, a last attempt to deflect responsibility and craft a narrative that might grant him some measure of sympathy. But the truth, the uncomfortable truth that we must face, is that Bundy made choices. He chose to view women as objects. He chose to indulge his fantasies. He chose to kill. And while we can study the psychology that enabled these choices, while we can examine the social factors that may have contributed to his development, we cannot allow explanations to become excuses. And this is the balance that Crime and Prejudice strives to maintain. Understanding without justifying, examining without exploiting, remembering that at the center of every true crime story are real people who suffered real trauma. And before we conclude, I need to share this important message. This story is based on real events and is shared for educational and informational purposes. It is not intended for viewers under 18 and does not glorify violence in any form. Please watch responsibly. And as we reflect on the Bundy case decades later, what remains most disturbing is not just what he did, but what he represents. The fragility of the assumptions we build our daily lives upon. The ease with which a predator can move among us when he understands the codes and signals of normalcy. And perhaps the most valuable lesson we can draw from this darkness is not about monsters, but about awareness. About trusting our instincts even when they contradict what our eyes are telling us. About recognizing that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs. That it often approaches wearing the mask of charm and normalcy and even concern. And in remembering Bundy's victims, in saying their names and acknowledging their humanity, we push back against his final crime, which was to reduce them to abstractions, to entries in his personal ledger of destruction. They were more than that. They were infinitely more than that. And the question that haunts us, the question that should haunt us, is not simply how did this happen, but how do we build a world where it becomes harder for such things to happen again, where the vulnerable are protected, where warning signs are recognized, where the social contract that Bundy exploited becomes more resilient against those who would weaponize it. And yet we must also acknowledge an uncomfortable reality, that for all our progress in criminal psychology and forensic science and law enforcement coordination, there will always be individuals who choose darkness, who find in the suffering of others some terrible satisfaction that the rest of us cannot comprehend. And perhaps that is the final lesson, that evil is not an aberration that can be fully explained and therefore prevented, but a permanent possibility within human nature itself, a shadow that walks beside us. And our responsibility is not to pretend it doesn't exist, but to remain vigilant, to protect the vulnerable, to build systems that make predation harder and justice more certain. To remember that behind every statistic is a life, a person who deserved to grow old, to love and be loved, to experience all the ordinary miracles that make existence worthwhile. And in the end, the story of Ted Bundy is not really about Ted Bundy at all. It's about the people he destroyed, the families he shattered, the fear he generated, and the sobering reminder that the monster is not always waiting in the shadows. Sometimes he's holding the door open for you, smiling that charming smile, and asking if you need help carrying something to his car.